This is Jeremy Benamy. I'm the president of J Street, and I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., and we are joined at the moment by Shira, Efron. I'm very optimistic that we will be joined as well by Sally, Abed any minute now. Shira is joining us from her safe room in Tel Aviv, where it is safe both from potential damage of incoming rockets, but also from your children at dinner time, so we can have a quiet conversation. So thank you so much for joining us, Shira. And thank you to everybody for being with us. This has been a very, very difficult 10 days for the people of both Israel and the Palestinians living in Gaza. And of course, on the West Bank, there has been some violence as well. Overall, this has just been a very fraught and difficult period. J Street has attempted to provide a voice through all of this that is committed to the resolution of this conflict and to understanding the roots of why we are where we are and how we can get out of this. We will be talking a bit with Shira and Sally about the situation from their perspective, both as Jewish and Arab Israeli citizens, and looking at what is happening within Israel. We'll also be talking to Ilan Goldberg in the second half of our briefing today about American policy and what the United States can be doing. What I would say right now in terms of J Street's positioning is, first and foremost, we have put an urgent call out to the President of the United States and to American policymakers to be doing more than has been done to date to try to bring about an immediate halt to the violence and a de-escalation of this conflict. We don't know when one wrong rocket, one wrong missile ends up in a place that sparks even deeper violence, and the cycle just cannot be stopped. This is absolutely critical for there to be a ceasefire as quickly as possible, and America's role in helping to achieve that is critical. Second, we've called for the appointment of a senior level special envoy to direct and coordinate U.S. policy on this conflict, not simply for the negotiation of this particular ceasefire. We'll be talking a bit to Ilan, as I said, about American policy and about that particular call. Third, we've said that the Biden administration is overdue in reversing a number of the steps taken by President Trump that have deepened the conflict and damaged America's ability to be a mediator, and those steps need to be taken immediately. And it relates to reopening the consulate in East Jerusalem, the PLO mission in the United States, reverse rules and opinions by the Trump team regarding settlements and occupation and U.S. funding over the Green Line. Fourth, we've pushed for humanitarian relief and a massive humanitarian effort to help the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. We'll hear a bit more about the depth of the crisis there in humanitarian terms. And finally, we've put out that there is the need for a real reset overall in the way the United States approaches this conflict. We have to put ending occupation at the center of that, understanding that when we provide a blank check and diplomatic immunity for what Israel does on a day-to-day basis, every day, day in, day out, it does create the conditions on which violence like this does erupt, and we need to have a far more active American role in oversight and transparency and restrictions on the use of our aid and the material bought by that aid and on the activities that the Israeli government is undertaking. So that's the J Street agenda. We'll be discussing a lot of those things in the course of the call. But at this point, I want to bring in to the conversation Shira, Efron, and as I said, we will be joined shortly, I do hope, by Sally as well. But Shira, thanks so much for joining us. I hope that you and your family are doing okay, all joking aside about the safe room and dinner and all the rest of it. I do hope that you're doing okay. And perhaps you could just start by telling us a little bit about what the past 10 days has been like for you. Give us a feel for what you've been experiencing as you've been living through this.
Thank you, Jeremy, for having me, and thank you for all tuning in. This is not just for the decor, it's the safe room. I will say that, because you're asking, normally I wouldn't take it to the personal level, but as someone who hasn't heard a siren since the first Gulf War in '91, because I was living back and forth, unfortunately for me, missed all Israel's rounds of fighting in Gaza and also with Lebanon. It was quite a shock to hear sirens, heavy rocket fire on Tel Aviv. Even beforehand, it was very traumatizing with family all over Jerusalem, with Sheikh Jarrah events, Al-Aqsa, obviously. And then taking it to the violence inside Israel proper, inside the Green Line, which is, I think, has not hurted me, the personal level, because I don't live in a mixed city, but he has hurt lots of friends, both Jewish and Palestinians, Arab Israelis. And it also, makes you question a lot of the things that you think about Israel. There have been so many, and also I at the RAND Corporation, we worked so much on coexistence and how do you narrow socioeconomic gaps between Israeli Arabs and the Jewish population in Israel. We looked at government funding, Resolution 922, which allocated 15 billion shekels to narrow these gaps. By the way, under Netanyahu's government. We saw during COVID that the Arab Israelis were overrepresented, if you will, relative to their share in population in medical teams, which also brought to something that we thought this whole issue was over. And we have to say it, and I think we're hearing more of this now, but at the beginning, those thugs on the streets, and those are thugs on both sides, right? If you have to speak about symmetry, there's thugs on both sides, and we can argue who is inciting them, and some of them in the Israeli are at the behest of the prime minister himself, but still it's thugs. But the sentiment exists. It's a genie out of the bottle, and it's very, very dangerous. It's not most of the population. I don't think most of the population is there, but it takes a lot of time to build trust, and the trust could get ruined very quickly, and that's what we're seeing now. I'm hoping for a ceasefire. I'll just say that, I have young children who were born and raised in California, and that's the first time they heard of rockets in the context of fighting and not in the context of a space museum. So it's a very unpleasant experience, but I think we do need to put it in perspective. We are the lucky ones to be living in a place that is not targeted frequently. We're not at the Gaza bordering communities, and obviously we're not in Gaza itself. We have a safe room. Most families don't have a safe room, and we have a place to be. So we're really not the main victims of this. Nonetheless, it's very disturbing, and it makes you question a lot of our assumptions, I think.
So, Shira, you are a research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. You're policy advisor at the Israel Policy Forum. You've worked with the RAND Institute. You've done a lot of
RAND Corporation.
RAND Corporation.
The RAND Institute is a highly conservative think tank with a political agenda. The RAND Corporation is a real nonpartisan research institution. So
noted, and thank you for that correction. Your research has really delved into the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, what the costs are for the people there, and what the options are. And I know already in the chat there was a question about when the fighting stops, which we can only hope is in the next 24, 48 hours. When the fighting stops, there will once again be yet another tremendous job ahead to rebuild. What have been some of the recommendations you've made? What would you urge the Biden administration and the international community to do when we finally reach that moment where the fighting is stopped and it's time to think about next steps in Gaza?
So maybe we'll just start with, just for the listeners that are not so well versed in the details, I don't know in terms of the number of casualties because they're picking up, but earlier today there were 213 deaths in Gaza, 97 of them women and children. So it's a really high ratio of civilian casualties, which is only growing with time as the fighting continues. We have 72,000 people that are internally displaced in Gaza that have lost their homes because hundreds of buildings have been destroyed completely, and then more thousands of buildings have been partially destroyed. This is something that will have to be constructed. 6 hospitals have been hurt, 11 clinics, including the only clinic in Gaza that is able to do PCR tests for COVID. We forget, but 10 days ago, we were worried about COVID outbreaks in Gaza. We are anticipating, you speak with the medical teams in Gaza, they are anticipating a big outbreak when this is all over and you can test again, just simply because you can't maintain any social distancing, right, at this level of crisis. In terms of electricity, formally, we talk about 3 to 4 hours electricity on average in different parts of Gaza. In practice, there are many parts that are completely without power. No running water, formally. 1 million people in Gaza now don't have access to drinking water. I'm speaking also with friends at the UN. They're at UN shelters, right? Those are the ones, the lucky ones. They say that water is not coming out of the tap, and if it is, it's very, very salty. Desal plants are not working. Sewage treatment plants are not working. And this, I'm telling you all this because it feels like a deja vu. It's again what I've been through and researching all these years. Sewage treatment facilities don't work. What it means is that raw sewage is flowing in Gaza itself, contaminating, risking waterborne diseases. We can talk about the specifics of these, but also flowing into the Mediterranean. Raw sewage, the numbers we had in 2018 when we assessed them, and I have a feeling they're very close to what we have today, and when you can reassess the damage, it's equivalent to 43 Olympic-size swimming pools of raw sewage, untreated sewage flowing into the Mediterranean every day. And guess where this is all flowing? Not because anyone has nefarious intentions, just because of the currents of the Mediterranean flows directly to Ashkelon, to the beaches of Israel. The risks of a cholera outbreak, again, are on the rise. Even bacteria, other viral infections, polio, meningitis. Those are things that we thought we were on the safe side when Gaza reconstruction was close to, was working, right? In 2014, the damage was so heavy that the international community came in and worked on comprehensive reconstruction of Gaza. This reconstruction finally ended now. I just spoke with a diplomat, a diplomat that was writing a report for their country, for their taxpayers, to say we finished the reconstruction of Gaza. And guess what? This is all they have to invest again. We're talking about $2 billion that the international community invested since 2014, and we're yet to assess the damage. In terms of recommendation, it's very, very difficult to say, right? Because the international community, first of all, if you look at aid to the Palestinians, it's reduced in half over the last decade. It's also tied to GDP because of COVID. Countries will have less money to spare. There are also other conflicts. You have Syria, you have Yemen. There's so many other places. I think I would prioritize continuing the infrastructure, the rights, the desalination plants, the sewage treatment plants, everything to prevent humanitarian crisis, and obviously the housing. The biggest challenge, and perhaps we can get into this in the Q&A, is if we think of the next step, right? Because Israel doesn't have a way out and there's no vision. What do you want? They want to restore deterrence and what do all these things want? But as long as you have Hamas controlling de facto the Gaza Strip, and as long as Hamas is what Hamas is, which is a terrorist organization, and as long as Israel is Israel, how do you change the situation so it doesn't happen every few years, that you have a massive damage, a population that's on the verge of humanitarian collapse, with an international community that's committed but cannot really continue to do so. I hope the US become more involved, and we can get into this. But the real goal would be to bring back the Palestinian Authority to Gaza. You can't do this without having a political horizon, without talking about real benefits to the PA. And this is something that, because of the political situation in Israel, no one dares to talk about. One of the things, and maybe I'll just end with this and we can open we'll go to another question, but I know one of the things that happened is in 2018, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, basically was fed up with paying for Gaza's essential needs, the electricity, because he said, well, if I'm paying for Gaza's civilian affairs, I should be the one controlling them, and they can't keep their arms, right? So he was fed up. There was a big dilemma. What do you do? Should Israel supply, because Israel sells electricity to Gaza, it doesn't give them electricity. And then Qatar jumped in, and Qatar was ready to pay for the fuel for the power plant that basically Abu Mazen stopped paying. That was an opening to Qatar that started paying for the fuel. And with the fuel came more and more Qatari involvement. I don't want to talk about Qatar as a country because it doesn't have Israel's interests and not necessarily the US interests in mind, but it's not so much about the giver, but it's about the destination. Overall today, those are the numbers. Qatar gives the Gaza Strip $360 million per year. 84 million of those go to the fuel. There's another 120 million that go to poor families that Hamas chooses. Now, it's not, we shouldn't be cynical about it. 80% of Gaza's population is on food aid. So there are a lot of poor people to choose from, but Hamas chooses who gets the $100 per month from Qatar. And then there's another $150 million that goes directly to Hamas. It goes to salaries. It goes to nice office buildings. It goes to depot that they have to store their stuff. And I think this arrangement, we now know that Israel basically facilitated, I don't know what to call it, it's protection payment for Hamas, right? Quiet for quiet, and we will give you money. Not the money for the desalination plant. This needs to continue. But how do you make sure the money terrorist organization that is seeking to, at least says, they're seeking to destroy you. And on the other hand, with your imperfect but security partner and peace partner, don't speak with them, undermine them, calling them terrorists, and doing everything in your power, the Israel government, to weaken them.
Let me ask you for your take on the Palestinian Authority and specifically on Abbas and the PLO. It is a very frequent line in this country, and I'm sure it is in Israel as well, and you see it in both places since you live in both places, that quote unquote, there is no partner. That actually the real problem, as Brett Stevens would say, is that the Palestinians, if Israel were to lay down its arms, all of Israel would be dead. If the Hamas and the PA would lay down their arms, there'd be peace. This is the frame from the right politically in this country, and I'm sure it's similar there. I wonder if you do see that there is a partner in the Fatah leadership, in Abbas, in the PA. They have been there for 16 years on a 4-year term. There is corruption. None of us are saying that there isn't incitement in textbooks or that, the Fatah website doesn't occasionally have anti-Semitic cartoons and all the rest of it. So let's be upfront about the shortcomings. But if one is looking for a route out of this, in your opinion, having studied this and dealt with the people, do you see that there is who to talk with on the Palestinian side in the official corridors of power?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. First of all, when we talk about corruption, I think we should not kid ourselves. It's so patronizing. Yeah, there's definitely corruption on the Palestinian side, but there are a lot of countries with high degrees of corruption that both the US and Israel deals with. We need to remember there's a prime minister in Israel, allegations of corruption charges facing trial. There was a prime minister in Israel that actually served time in prison for corruption, right? So kind of a bit of a hypocritical, and also from the US, I don't want to remind you the reports that we've been through with the Trump administration, right? I mean, corruption is, they're corrupt. Not good, especially not good for Palestinian state building, right? For the Palestinians, but that doesn't make you not a partner. In terms of if there's anyone to talk to, listen, that we are seeing sporadic fire in the West Bank. But 2 days ago, we were joking that the West Bank is the quietest place in the Middle East. There was more fire in Israel inside the Green Line, and it's not because the Palestinians of the West Bank. It's not because Hamas is not trying to steer violence there. It's only because you have a security partnership, a robust security partnership. Some will say, and this is why Abbas is getting criticism, because it's not Israel like partner; it's Israel's subcontractor. Collaboration. So of course there's a partner. There's a partner for security cooperation. There's a partner in environmental stuff. There's a partner on COVID. There's a partner on all these things. The next step is, do you take it to the next level, right? And are they getting more sovereignty? I don't want to speak about the individuals themselves. Listen, Mahmoud Abbas himself, he's been around for a long, long time. They're all been around for a long, long time. All elderly men. They've done good things and less good things, but the institutions of the PA they exist, and those institutions, regardless of who is in them, need to be strengthened. And there will be a partner there. It's interesting that you say this, because I think there would be many people, including previous mediators in the process, that said that there's a tough competition between who's less of a partner, the Israeli side or the Palestinian side. the fact that the Prime Minister Netanyahu, in all his tenure, has not spoken to Abu Mazen. There hasn't been anything from this side. Now, as long as the political situations on both sides, I think, changes, something has to change, right? It's very difficult with the same actors. I wouldn't recommend the US to start a peace process, direct negotiations on final status issues. But do you have a partner to do steps, and this goes into the weeds, I don't know, to transfer some more territory to Palestinian sovereignty from areas, C to B? Can you empower them with some more sovereignty over border crossing? It's so ironic that if you think about it from certain perspectives, Hamas has so much more sovereignty in Gaza than the PA could dream of in the West Bank. And we always talk, and people say in Israel, oh, you need to strengthen the PA. So what, do you give them a few more hours of Allenby Bridge to Jordan being open? No, you need to do this very, very seriously with the plan, go into transformational steps. And I hope Ilan Goldberg will go into this, because without the US, I really doubt this will happen. It is not in the interest of Israel. The PA itself is powerless. The Europeans bankroll the PA, so they're in a different place, and they also have different leverage on Israel. I know it's not a priority for the US, but I have concrete recommendations. I think the quartet is not dead. I think the US can work within the framework of the quartet, and then it's more of a multilateral approach, right? It's not the US again shouldering the burden of doing this. And you can take it step by step and building that partner.
So I do want to bring Ilan in about 3 or 4 minutes, before we do, though, and I don't mean to make you, quote unquote, speak on behalf of all of Israel, but there are a number of questions in the chat about Israeli public opinion. For instance, this morning, Michael Oren apparently was on Morning Joe claiming that 80% of Israelis want Israel to keep up their attacks. Do you think that that is the case? There's a question here about where does some of this right-wing sort of the Jewish racist lynch mob come from? Is it something that's always there, or is there a real increase in their numbers recently? Do you see that? And, do you see any turning of public opinion against Netanyahu, which of course is the exact opposite of what Michael Oren is saying, for his intransigence on a ceasefire and his actions? So sort of a series of questions about, quote unquote, Israeli public opinion, and if you could give some insights into for our audience into that.
Sure. So Israeli public opinion, and this has been the case in every operation. So it's a playbook. It always got Israel is rallying behind this operation. The IDF is the most moral military in the world. Hamas overshoot, and we are doing everything that we can. The world can go, can complain, but this is what we are suffering. Interestingly, and I think this is part of the reason that this operation continues despite pressure from the international community, is that what domestic considerations matter more. And you would see even the Gaza bordering communities, all the heads of the municipalities on the left and right, they were urging continuation of the operation. What happens is usually, and now I think we're at this point, that you're starting to hear the doubts. So what Michael Oren wrote, I think it's okay, but I think in 2-3 days, we're going to see more. You start hearing questions from different commentators and on the news. And what's the goal of this operation? What are you trying to achieve? What is the next step? What are we trying to get at it? What's the margin, right? That if you think of diminishing returns, there are no more quality targets. What are we trying to get? And how, if in the absence of a strategy, Israel doesn't want to conquer Gaza, even though I did see that Netanyahu said that Israel might go back to invade Gaza and take over. I think it's nonsense, because no one wants to do this in Israel. People are asking. So I think public opinion is going to turn against this. Public opinion on Netanyahu, it's very difficult. Listen, he doesn't get, if you look at the numbers, I mean, the last elections, he wasn't able to build a coalition. He is deemed Mr. Security. And during crisis, I like the fact that there's someone with experience. But it depends. You have to remember also that Israel just emerged from COVID. Finally, the kids started going to school again, right? you finally started seeing economic activity, and all of a sudden nothing again. So I think Israelis are starting to get more edgy about it. There was a Jewish holiday of Shavuot. People were fine with it. My gut feeling is that in 2 days, the public opinion against this operation is going to start turning. Sorry, you had another question. Oh, the right-wing mobs. It's a very good question. Some of it is organic, but a lot of it is the Lahava and Antifa. Those are very extreme Jewish groups being incited by Itamar Ben-Gvir and the likes, affiliated with the Kahana party. We need to remember, if you look back, Itamar Ben-Gvir opened an alternative office in Sheikh Jarrah when this all started. They're busing them from cities. So in Bat Yam, you had mobs coming in. Those are not Bat Yam residents. They were busing them from different places. And I'm just going to end with this because it's very similar to what happened in the US and some of this criticism you hear. Itamar Ben-Gvir, since this started, even though you had police people, official police saying that he is risking starting an intifada, he got 600 hours of screen time on Israeli TV. And people are saying, just why do you let him be on prime time? He's instigating the violence, but it brings ratings, and I'm sure it sounds very familiar because you've all been through this, not as recently. So this is where it's coming from, and this does serve Netanyahu politically.
Well, thank you for the insight, Shira, and please do stay with us for the conversation. And I'm really glad that we've been joined by Sally Abed. And sorry if there was any technical difficulties there in joining us, but it's a great point in the conversation to bring you in. For those who don't know, Sally is a staff person. She's the resource development director, so be careful. She might reach out to you if you express support for what she's doing. She's the resource development director for Standing Together, which is just simply an incredible, hope-inspiring grassroots people's movement that is focused on bringing together the citizens of Israel, both Jewish and Arab, to build a cohesive, progressive force on the left in Israel on the issues that so many in J Street care about. And so, Sally, we are big fans of Standing Together at J Street. And I think what the folks who are signed in here, we've got well over 1,000 people, I think, between the Zoom and Facebook. I think what people are really dying to hear is a little bit of perspective from you and from the community there that is trying to bring Jews and Arabs together within Israel, because the violence between the two segments of Israeli society has been so noticeable and significant and really painful. And so we'd love to hear your perspectives on this.
First of all, terribly sorry for joining late, and thank you so much for inviting us here and for the kind words. You know, we are, as Jeremy really mentioned, we are a grassroots. We are the largest Jewish Arab grassroots in Israel, and we have been organizing for years now, for 6 years. As grassroots, which really evolves and organizes around shared struggles, it usually makes us much stronger when we are organizing around issues, you know, around the shared economic interests or gender interests or things that are less national and less political in that sense. In these times, this is the real challenge. And I don't think as a movement we have ever felt as responsible as we are right now, and the responsibility that we have right now as a grassroots to really navigate the conversation and impact the conversation into a place that makes us that not only de-escalates the situation, but also, you know, hopefully when this nightmare ends, we will actually be able to not regress as a shared society, and not regress as the conversation shouldn't be, you know, in 2000, in October 2000, really, the shared society and the notion, the idea of shared society really took a hit, and it took us many years to really recover that. And I think in the past couple of years, we have been able to recover it and really strengthen shared society, Jewish Arab shared society. And we see that. We see that in a sense that we were able to mobilize thousands of people. We still are. Just right now, I am in Haifa right now. I live in Jaffa, and there are people, there are Jewish people in Palestinian protests, and there are joint stands everywhere, in many junctions, many bridges, many places, and it's a ray of light and hope in a very, very, very dark places. I'm more than happy to take questions, really, about what exactly we're doing and what's our vision and what's the day after.
Terrific, thank you. And we've also now been joined by Ilan Goldberg, and many of you know Ilan and his role during the Obama administration in the Special Envoy's Office on Middle East Peace, and as a real leader and expert over at the Center for New American Security. And he has led a number of major reports and studies that not only have looked at the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and the American role in it, but also specifically at the question of Gaza, which we were discussing earlier. And I think there's a lot of interest from people on this briefing, and I see it in the Q&A, as to what the American role can be, perhaps a little bit of an analysis, Ilan, as to why it is that the Biden administration has taken the positioning that it has, which essentially has given space for 9 or 10 days now to this Israeli operation without leaning in more forcefully. And perhaps we're reaching the end of that rope, but if you could give us sort of the several-minute version of your analysis of the current situation, then Sally, we'll come back to you for a little bit more diving into what's happening within Israel itself. So, Ilan?
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy, and great to be with you and J Street and Shira and Sally. So what the Biden administration, from what I can tell and from discussions with them, it seems that their position thus far and what they've said publicly is that they're pushing behind the scenes for a ceasefire, but have been relatively hesitant to publicly criticize the Israelis. And they've taken a lot of flack for that. And frankly, it would not have been where I would have been personally, but actually, it might come back to work out as a smart strategy, depending on what we see over the next couple of days. And so I think so I want to just explain the thinking that goes into it first, right? Which is, one, I think that, President Biden is kind of old school on this issue, having, how long he's been following it and keeping track of it. And so I think his instinct is to have the US and Israel aligned publicly and to keep those discussions private is the most effective way to impact Israeli calculus. That's his thought process. And there is some argument too that makes sense for that, especially when it comes to Gaza right now, which is the conflict we're trying to end, which is, first, we need to remember the US is not the central mediator in a conflict between Israel and Hamas because we don't talk to Hamas, right? Egypt is a central mediator. The UN plays a very important role. We have an important role in playing in pushing the Israelis, given our relationship, and also sometimes in keeping out all the other would-be mediators who want to get involved. That frankly, I think make things historically more complicated and make it less likely that you're going to get to a quick ceasefire by creating more channels. So we can do that, support the Egyptians, push the Israelis privately. There's also a thought process, I think, that was going on here, which was this conflict, once it started, was going to go for a few days. And if the president had come out very forcefully at the very start, he would have immediately caused a public confrontation with Bibi Netanyahu, which would have then played to Bibi's domestic politics, actually decreased U.S. leverage and given the U.S. more space, given Netanyahu and Israel more space, I think, to go on longer. So the thought process was, let's start this privately, let's give them some space, and then as the pressure builds, that's when and it seems more ripe, that's the moment to come in and sort of say, okay, time for this to end. And I think we're kind of getting to that moment now. I think, but there's been a real cost with this, in addition to just the conflict going on, right? Which is both internationally for the United States being isolated, having an administration come in talking about resetting on multilateralism after Trump, and also, just in terms of the Biden administration's focus on human rights, as you see what's happening in Gaza. But one of the interesting developments, and I'll say this is thanks to J Street and a lot of others who have been doing work on this for years, is we do see now a dynamic developing where Congress is starting to apply pressure, right? The president of the United States is able to play the good cop with Israel, while Congress, to some extent, especially Democrats, are able to play the bad cop. So the president is able to now say in private conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu, like, I can only do this for so long. Look at my domestic politics. And like Bibi understands domestic politics. I mean, he understands it better than anybody. I mean, he lives by it. And so this is a point of extra leverage for the United States. And it comes from the meaningful pressure that's been applied and is being applied, which has come from years and years of work of shifting how the, Israel, the US, especially Democrats, think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so maybe I'll just say one last thing on this, is having been somebody who worked on this issue in 2014 during the last Israel-Gaza war. I worked for John Kerry. He flew over there. He spent 2 weeks flying around. Like, at the end of the day, like, there's this balance we as the US need to strike. If we make it all about us, it doesn't necessarily help. And it actually in some ways complicates, right? But if we aren't there aggressively pushing, then we're not doing enough to push the Israelis. And so like, this is like a really hard position for the administration to be in. I think what matters more at this point is like also what they do afterwards. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about that.
So I wanted to also address and move the clock, not just forwards, but move the clock back. Last Monday at 6 p.m. was when Hamas fired the first rockets, essentially. That was their deadline. And a lot of the conversation about these kinds of conflicts often starts with that first rocket, and then the question becomes, how should Israel respond, and how do we stop the response so that we get to a ceasefire? And you just basically focus from the 6 p.m. on the Monday when the firing starts forward. I want to roll the clock back before, and there's been a number of questions in the Q&A and in the chat, pointing out that we have gone, 38 minutes into this without mentioning the word occupation, and we did not really dig in to the question of Jerusalem and the evictions. And I do want to focus in on the Biden administration and what it did not do in the first 100 days, and what is necessary in order for the United States to effectively stop the deterioration of the situation on the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. It's a process of never-ending occupation, of creeping annexation. It is a process that is expanding the Jewish presence in Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, threatening the status quo on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif. And yet the Biden administration in the first 100 days really had nobody focused on this at all, and did not follow through on the hope for reversal of a number of things that happened under the Trump administration. So I guess my question to both Shira and to Ilan from a policy perspective, and then Sally, I'd like to bring you in from the perspective of the community in Israel. What responsibility does the Biden administration need to take for failing to step forward to stop some of the things that lit some matches here that set off some of this? And what should we be focused on regarding American policy to stop the process of creeping annexation and never-ending occupation? So let me start with you, Shira, and then Ilan, and go over to Sally.
I just want to, I have a caveat of saying, right, this administration, it hasn't been in for 120 days, who's counting? So it's really the beginning. And so it's quite unfortunate for them, for this to happen, and to remind everyone in Israel and all security assessments were that neither Israel nor Hamas has an incentive to enter a violent escalation. So this is kind of like a surprise, right? And we can talk about everything that led to this and the match that set up the fire in Jerusalem. We always said at Al-Aqsa is the most explosive thing. There are different reports and how this all started. But I don't know what the United States could have done, what the Biden administration could have done specifically at this point to prevent this flare up, right? It didn't happen. The conditions are not under their watch. We're talking about decades and decades of problematic policies, of having really complex political situations. I think situation on the ground. I will say that, and again, I think at this point it's too early to criticize and maybe to offer some constructive engagement, right? It is the fact that you have Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Hadi Amar coming him. It's not a high-level person. He's a personal friend, very well-meaning, but there's a limit to what he can do without staff, even with all the backing in the world. You don't have an ambassador here. You don't have any secretary. You don't have the people in the middle that can tackle a situation, right, when it happens. And things here always happen. So I guess they could have staffed better, right? Having personnel in place that can respond to the situation. I haven't seen yet a plan which I think we would all appreciate of sort of what's the next step. Yeah, the US can help maybe put leverage on Israel, and we're seeing it starting today, and Ilan was talking about it, right, to reach a ceasefire. But what's the day after? You're talking about occupation. I don't think Israel is going to end the occupation anytime soon, and it's too early, and I don't blame them. No one wants to go into facilitating a peace process between Israelis and Palestinians as long as political leaderships on both sides don't. But there's so much that the US can do, and I mentioned the quartet before, can work with the quartet. You can advance real economic development, the MEPA, right, the people to people, the investment stuff, the consulate. I know they're working on all these things, right? They take time to implement, but having more strong signals of a policy and directions, I think would do justice. I'm going to say this now because I think it is an important message. Inquiring with the Prime Minister's office, I'm not going to say at what level, but it was a pretty senior official. I was saying before Hadi Amar came to visit, I asked something about how they're preparing for the visit, and they didn't know who he was. I thought it's a joke. They didn't know who it was. It tells you a lot both about the Israeli side, but it also tells you about the American side. So I think more active engagement, and you think about it as preventative care, right? It's always less expensive than trauma. It would be easier to do. And I know there are a lot of plans. Ilan was involved in writing those plans, strategies going forward. There's so many. The quartet report of 2016 is coming 5 years to its report that's never been implemented. We can go into the details of it, but there's so much that can be done short of ending the occupation in this moment, not because we don't want it. We all want it, but it's not a realistic goal but you can set the conditions, starting a process that hopefully one day would lead to it. I'm sure Ilan has a lot to add.
And I just want to add, there's been a couple of points when we've mentioned the quartet, and several times people have asked, what is the quartet? So just very quickly, it is a group of 4 actors in this conflict who have worked together. The United States, Russia, the UN, and the EU, I believe, is the 4th. Is that correct, Ilan? Those are the 4 actors, part of the quartet. The mechanism was relatively disabled during the Trump years, and it is being at least revived a bit under this administration, although we have yet to see it really used to its fullest extent. So I just want to explain what the quartet is. So let me turn to Ilan, then back to Sally. And, Sally, there's been a number of questions. I don't know if you're looking in the questions about the organization, what it does, and other effective channels for helping at the grassroots and people-to-people level. So I'll turn to you for that in a second. But Ilan, just further thoughts on American policy options and what could have been done, what should be done following this in order to try to begin to put us on the right path instead of heading in the wrong direction.
Sure. Well, I think a couple of things. I think on the staffing question that Shira mentioned, I think that's exactly right. I'd actually start with the consulate and the fact that the Trump administration pulled it down, and it's been a challenge thus far to get it up again. Because look, when I was in government, a lot of times what you would have is, when stuff started to bubble in Jerusalem, right, or in the West, but elsewhere, it'd be the consulate who was watching things on the ground and monitoring the situation. We've been joined by a guest, which I think is awesome, from Shira. You'd have this very specific reporting that would then get tossed up to Washington, and you'd start to engage to quietly tamp it down before it got out of control. So the perfect example being the story if folks are familiar with, it just came out in the Times a couple of days ago about the snipping of the loudspeakers at the Temple Mount would be exactly the type of Haram al-Sharif, which would have been exactly the type of thing that, the consulate would have reported on, and we would have started tracking. So I would argue reopen the consulate, get eyes on the ground to start monitoring the situation would be one. I would argue Hadi is an incredibly capable, smart guy who knows these issues very well. the administration would be smart to promote him to special envoy, which I think would give him like more juice and ability. The administration's instinct from the beginning was not to sort of make this issue number one, and I get that. But when you have a special envoy for Libya and you have a special envoy for the Horn of Africa and a special envoy for Yemen and a special envoy for Iran, I just don't see the harm of having a special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also. And then, yeah, getting an ambassador over there, that might have taken time anyway. I actually don't criticize them for, like, it takes time to get people confirmed. It takes time to get people in office. This is that the pace that they're on is not really all that different than previous administrations on some of these issues that would not have happened by now. But you do have, frankly, the U.S. embassy in Tel Aviv, or Jerusalem, I guess, excuse me. I still always say U.S. Embassy Tel Aviv, is just not really, it almost feels like the public messaging coming out of there is like the Trump administration never changed. Like you do need to like, and the ambassador or charge right now is supposed to be engaging Israelis and Palestinians, and you don't get that vibe at all. So I think there's a lot that you can do with the American presence on the ground before you get the ambassador in, which is sort of like what everybody focuses on. In terms of, and so, you know, if those things had been in place, especially the consulate, we might have caught this earlier. It might have been higher level engagement earlier. We might never have been in this position. I'm not sure I fully put that on the Biden administration. I'd put a lot of that in the Trump administration because, you know, and then in terms of just going forward, I think having that function, also, you know, focusing a lot on Gaza with the assistance that we've restarted, I think is especially important. And that's, you know, electricity, water, but also maybe this is a moment to press the Israelis in the aftermath of the conflict on starting to get work permits, freedom of movement, ability of some Gazans to leave Gaza, because that is so essential for the Gazan economy. You know, and then and also I would argue like another thing that the administration might start doing and should start doing is talking more about rights and more about this sort of lexicon of like putting I think one of the things the administration is recognizing is like this surge in the Democratic Party around this issue. And just a couple more things here. I do think in the long run, you know, you need a change in Israeli politics and Palestinian politics. On the Israeli side, I don't think anything shifts until Bibi Netanyahu is out, fundamentally. Bibi is the Donald Trump of Israel at this point. He's a lot smarter than Donald Trump, but the damage he is doing to Israeli democracy is on that level. And so until he is gone, even if you have, you know, a government led by Bennett, it would still be better. It would, you know, Bennett and Lapid, because at least Bennett, you know, to draw a parallel to American politics would be more like Liz Cheney, right? Like at least there'd be some principle there and some sort of support for democracy, and you'd have a sort of more unified. So we need to get out of this Israeli political deadlock and get Bibi out eventually. And then just on the Palestinian side, engaging in Palestinian politics, I think we should have probably been more out there in support of Palestinian elections. We have to be out there supporting things like unity in elections. We have to be out there supporting like a vision for the aftermath of Gaza, which we've written extensively about in our report, and maybe like can be done with the UN Security Council resolution after this conflict, something we tried to do in 2014 and almost got to at least begin that process of supporting Palestinian unity and an end to the blockade in some kind of way. But that requires long-term focus. And I think the administration it's not gonna, you know, we should not be now saying the Middle East is more important than, for example, China or development at home or like COVID. But like, I think there will be a lot more attention to this issue, like after this conflict is done.
Right. And you know, you mentioned political change within Israel. And I want to turn to Sally, because I think one of the glimmers of hope that some of us have had over the past couple of years is the prospect of greater integration into the mainstream of Israeli politics of the Arab citizenry and of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the acceptance of some of their political representatives, you know, into the bloodstream of the conversation. And so I'm curious whether, you know, what your take is on the chances for political change from within Israel, and what role the kind of work that you are forging. A number of people have been apparently looking for your website. Perhaps you can repeat the name of your organization and the website and clarify exactly what you do.
I'll send the website right now.
Terrific. And
the English one.
What's your
we
insights
have a Hebrew
into
Arabic one, but
the politics?
First of all, I'm not going to pretend like I have any additional thing to say. about the Biden administration. You know, I am a simple activist, an organizer. You said I'm the resource development coordinator, but I'm part of the national leadership and I do organize in the field. So I do know a big deal about what's happening here, especially within our society, the Arab Palestinian society in Israel. I do want to say two things about the Biden administration. One thing that you could do is, you know, stop funding military, you know, equipments and weapons. That's one thing that they can do, and actually invest this money in American citizens. That's a very provocative thing to say, I think, in the US, but I have to say it. The other thing that I think needs to be done, and it doesn't necessarily just fall on the US, but in general, but especially on the US, giving, you know, the ties and giving their impact on this situation, is there's a very big disconnect on basically I don't think the administration understands these changes, the political changes that I'm going to talk about. You know, I don't think they really understand the changes within civil society, within the Israeli left or the peace camp, or within the Palestinian community within Israel, which I think is also, you know, something that is completely misunderstood within American public in general, and Jewish American public in particular. I think that one of the main changes that are happening is that there is, when it comes to the conflict, when it comes to the occupation, traditionally the peace camp really was Jewish solidarity to Palestinians. That's what it was. Right now, I think what the change, the main change, is the fact that we are building an understanding that no one will actually enjoy security and freedom without everyone being free and secure, in a sense that ending the occupation is necessarily, and security is necessarily the interest of the majority of the people that live here. That's a message that is very powerful. That's a message that tens of thousands of people stand behind in the streets, stood behind in the streets in the past 10 days now, I think. Who's counting? And that's a very, very major change, in a sense that we really are, it's enforced, you know, one of the largest cracks or gaps within Israeli society and within the coexistence narrative was the fact that, you know, we are separate, that somehow the Arab society here in Israel has different interests than the Jewish one, and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have different one than the people who live here. And that's something that is changing, I think, on the ground, this deep understanding. The second thing is exactly something that I say very, very nonchalant, you know, very easily. However, it is really not yet to be normalized, which is the fact that we are Palestinian. And that's something that I think people need to start understanding. And, you know, people are surprised that, you know, we are, you know, the community here, the Arab community within Israel is affected by what happens in Gaza or in Sheikh Jarrah, in Eastern Jerusalem. You know, these are things that are very, very interconnected. I don't know what Shira, you know, I came in the middle of her talking about, you know, what's happening on the ground, and I see people asking about media coverage and about a guy from al-Fahim, which was a center of, which is the second largest Arab town in Israel, and was a center of the larger protests that were happening in the past half a year against the violence and organized crime. You know, a very politicized place. That's my meaning. And there was a guy who was shot in the head by the police force 8 days ago. He died today. No one talked about it. No one. Gaza, that's here in Israel. That's an Israeli citizen who was shot dead by the police in the head, live bullet, okay? No one talked about it. No one. The police didn't even have a report. When we went as with the media people, they didn't even have anything official out about it. So that's just one thing that I'm giving you. As Palestinians here, we have been going to protests. We have been provoked. It really is very orchestrated. And I think Shira was really talking about it. There's no inter-community violence. There really is very few. Obviously, there are, deliberate attacks, Arabs against Jews, Jews against Arabs. Very unfortunate, very sad. A Jewish citizen from Lud was killed by stones. It's a horrific, sights and horrific, however, very isolated incidences that we really don't want them to design or frame our narrative right now. What is happening is organized violence. They are coming in droves, in buses to Haifa, to Lud, settlers from the West Bank and from other places, organized, and many of them affiliated with the Ben Gvir and the likes. And they are doing the provocations. The Arab provocations, they are lighting their own cars. Half of the cars that were burned were Arab owned. We could go into this. You guys had the same conversation when the Black Lives Matter arson and vandalism happened. We're not going to go into it right now. But most of the violence that happened within Palestinian are with police. We had the only indictments that we had in the last 10 days are of Arab citizens in Israel. What I'm trying to get here is that I'm sorry that I'm longer. I'm just trying to paint a picture of what's happening on the ground. What's happening on the ground is that there is a major shift in the understanding that, we cannot separate what happens within here and what happens outside. And that Arab-Jewish partnership within Israel necessarily needs to acknowledge the common interest of ending the occupation within Israel as a major goal.
Well, it is impossible to cover this entire topic and address all aspects of it in an hour. I know that everybody who's tuned in here undoubtedly has 1,000 more questions and topics they'd love to hear. It's wonderful to have the perspective that Sally brings from within Israel. It was great to hear from Shira. Wonderful to have Ilan join us and provide a U.S. policy perspective. There's a number of questions in the chat about J Street's perspective, and I'll just close with 1 minute on that because we are at the end of the hour. First of all, J Street does remain committed to the notion that the long-term resolution of this conflict does still require that there be a state of Israel that is the national homeland of the Jewish people and a state of Palestine that is the national homeland of the Palestinian people. It is a wonderful thought that perhaps all 13 plus million people between the river and the sea could live together in peace and harmony in a single state that provides democratic rights. But in our view as J Street, that continues to be a less likely outcome than the division of the land into two states for two people, which itself at this point looks like a very unlikely outcome. The sad truth is that without a political resolution, either two-state or one, we're condemned to see these cycles of violence. This is one state. What we've witnessed for the last 10 days is a one-state reality. This is a one-state nightmare. The one state is not the solution. It is the problem. And as J Street, our view is that the United States does have a national security interest in trying to help these two people to find a path out of this terrible, terrible reality in which children are dying, families are living in fear. I urge people to listen to the Daily podcast this morning with an interview of a young woman, 22-year-old woman from Gaza. If you want to hear in the voice and her own words what Gaza is like for a family and for a young woman trying to grow up and have a future and a life, the Daily podcast today is a wonderful window into that horrific reality. And so J Street is dedicated to trying to help. And I know that Ilan, your work in trying to outline U.S. policies that can help. That's the role that we can play here in the United States, and supporting the work of Standing Together, supporting the work of other great organizations, Gisha, Physicians for Human Rights, a whole slew of organizations that are trying to help the people of Gaza, people that asked for some recommendations, and those are wonderful organizations. And I urge all those who are listening today to stay engaged, support the work of these incredible groups, press your members of Congress for American engagement to end this conflict and to move towards a deeper American role that is productive and looking to resolve conflict, not deepen it. So with those words, I want to say thank you again to Sally for dialing in, and of course to Ilan for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't have more time, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, and good luck to all of us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.